I'm Greg Ruby with Acoustic Guitar, and today we are going to learn to play Chord-Melody to the classic 1920s jazz standard, Whispering. A simple definition of Chord-Melody is the art of simply playing the melody and the chord simultaneously. To do so, we're going to need to learn our fretboard from the left to the right. So just one string at a time playing the melody and being able to place a chord or one of the different inversions of the chord along with that melody note. So by starting, we're going to start with example 1, in which we're going to take a simple G Triad. By doing so, our high note of G, stacked from lowest to highest, we have B, D, and G. Our G note becomes the melody note, while the entire chord is still the G. We're going to move that cluster up to the next available combination of those three notes, where we find D, G, and B. Now we have a G chord, but our melody note is the note B. We're going to move it up again on those same three strings to find the notes G, B, and D, making the D our melody note. In example 2, we piece together a simple chord melody with a very familiar song. Now, in order to find the different melody notes up and down the neck and to support them with chords beneath it, we're going to need to know the inversions of many of our chords. And we're going to start with G7, our first 4-note voicing. So if we play this down here in the at the 3rd fret, we have the F, the B, the D, and the G. Now the way to find these inversions is we will map out all the notes going up and down each string one at a time. So if we put the notes of G7 in sequential order, we have G, B, D, and F. So we're going to find those going up each string. Starting from our G7 chord of the notes from lowest to highest, F, B, D, G, we're going to go up each string, finding the notes of a G7 in sequential order, G, B, D, and F. So starting on the high E string, we have G, we go up to B, we go up to D, and then we make our way up to F. On the 2nd string, we have D, the next note in that sequence is an F, then we have G, then we have B. On the next string, we have B, we have D, we have F, and we have G. And on the 4th string, starting at the 3rd fret, we have F, we have G, we have B, and we have D. Now placing those together, we have G7, 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 and G7. 4 versions or inversions of G7, but each of those slightly different because it produces a different melody note on the top of each chord. G is on the top, B is on the top, D is on the top, F is on the top. Now, we may come across a melody note that is not a part of the G7 chord, meaning it's not G, B, D, or F. But they're still asking for the note G7 with that. So we need to also become familiar with the notes in between these. So this is what I like to think of as a chord scale. We have G7 with the G, and then when we add the note A, becomes a G9. We go up to the next inversion. We have B, we add the note C, it becomes a G sus4. Then we go up and we want the note D. I like using this this version of the G7. And turns it into a G9 here because our G comes up to the A, but it frees up our pinky to be able to reach up and play the note E for the next one, making it a G13 and then G7 with the F. Now, while we have a lot of fancy names for it, they're all just a G7 chord, but with a different melody note. G is the melody, A is the melody, B, C, D, E, and F. In the song Whispering, we're going to want to play our phrases primarily on one string at a time. So, for example, the opening phrase of Whispering is all played on the E string. To support that, we're going to place our chords beneath it. When we come to the D9 chord, we're going to hold it for 2 beats before releasing it to play the melody notes D and E. So we'll play the chord, release, and then we come back and play the D9 again, but we strum all the way through the first string to produce that high A, because the melody itself goes. So in combination. Now it should be noted here that one helpful technique for bringing out the note on the B string is employing a rest stroke if you're using plectrum style, where the pick will strum through that B string and land on the E string below it. And this enables you just to kind of give it just a little more volume towards the end of your strum. Then we go to a G13, to a G7. Now here when we hit this C, good old C chord there, we're going to play just these 3 notes of it, and then our pinky is going to add the note D, and then we're going to go over to the high E. And we're going to play this phrase legato. So we're going to sustain that chord down below and play those other 2 notes while still holding it. Then we're reaching up to a C6-9, to a C6, to a C major 7. Although we can also just think of all of these as versions of C with the melody. With those melody notes. Now here we are going to the G9 or G7 with a melody note of A, to the G as the melody note, to the B as the melody note, back to the A and G. So, and then that's going to bring us to our first repeat. When we come around to the D minor, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to let those bottom 2 notes sustain as we play the open E to the Fs. So again, a sense of legato, a sense of sustain. And then we're going to transition with our first finger up to that note G at the 3rd fret. And that's going to set us up for the next D minor chord at the 5th fret. Little D minor triad there. And that'll continue up the same shape up at the, with the note C as the melody note at the 8th fret. So all that together. And then resolving finally to C. Whispering. Thank you for listening to my lesson on chord melody playing. For acoustic guitar, this is Greg Ruby.